welcome to Arguably, powered by the Zira Institute. I'm Maral Salmassi. My guest today is Izabella Tabarovsky, one of the leading experts on Soviet anti-Zionism and its lasting impact on Western political culture. She grew up in the Soviet Union and later moved to the West, which gives her a very rare perspective. She understands not just what this ideology is, but how it was constructed, how it was packaged, and how it was exported. Because a lot of what people today experience as spontaneous moral language, terms like colonialism, apartheid, liberation, didn't just emerge organically. These concepts have a history, and in many cases, that history runs straight through Soviet propaganda. So in this conversation, we are going to trace that lineage and ask a slightly uncomfortable question. To what extent is today's anti-Zionism, including in parts of the Western left, actually the continuation of a very successful ideological project? And before we start, if you find these conversations valuable, please subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps us grow the channel. So let's begin. Hi, Izabella. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Maral. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let me start here because I think most people get this wrong. Most people think of anti-Zionism as just a political position. Your work suggests something much deeper, that what we are seeing today is at least in part the afterlife of a very deliberate Soviet project. So before we get into the present, what was the Soviet Union actually trying to do with anti-Zionism? When they used that term, what did they mean? And how far was that from what Zionism actually is?
Well, look, first of all, it's a crucial question, and it's one that usually takes me about 90 minutes to explain in a lecture. But I can start off by saying that absolutely what we're hearing today in terms of tropes, in terms of explanatory logic, in terms of how the anti-Zionists see the world, it has there are echoes of what we used to hear in the USSR where I grew up. But it's not just echoes. There were actually direct channels of transmission. So we are literally today, when people say that Zionists are Nazis, or that Israel is a Nazi state, or that Israelis or that Palestinians are the new Jews and the Israelis are the new Nazis, we are literally using terms that were invented and propagated by the KGB throughout the world during the Cold War. When we are talking about Israel committing genocide in Palestinian territories, and it's not true because Israel is not committing genocide in Palestinian territories, but when we're using that as a lie and a libel, we are literally using a lie and a libel that was invented and popularized and spread around the world by the Soviet Union in the late 60s and onward. When we hear that Israel is like South Africa, and factually, it's simply incorrect, right? But when people use that as a libel, they're repeating something that the KGB put in its books and its propaganda brochures 50 years ago, 60 years ago, okay? So this is, and absolutely, this is what we are talking about today. The USSR, I always say in my lectures, was always anti-Zionist. It was against the Zionist ideology, or against the Zionist worldview, let's put it that way, for many reasons. It goes back to the early 20th century. For many reasons, the Bolsheviks, Lenin, early Stalin, saw Zionists as political competition for the loyalties of the Jewish masses. They wanted the Jewish masses to go with the idea of socialism, which is an internationalist ideology, as opposed to Zionism, which is a nationalist ideology. So there was partly that. The Bolsheviks believed that Zionists were wrong, that anti-Semitism will solve itself once socialism arrives. So they were saying, you don't need to drag all the Jews to somewhere across the world. If Jews are having a problem with anti-Semitism, all we need is socialism. We need a revolution, then we need the socialist system, and then anti-Semitism will disappear. And of course, it didn't disappear, and it went on. And Soviet anti-Zionism went through different stages of evolution. It changed itself under Stalin. Under late Stalin, it acquired this conspiracist aspect in which you are no longer arguing against an actual worldview. At least the Bolsheviks early on were arguing against an actual worldview. They argued against it from positions that personally I disagree with. They were Marxist positions, but you can see the logic. You get to late Stalin and you start to see this conspirological perspective when there is this idea that there are Zionists among Jews who want to undermine and sabotage the Soviet government and the Soviet system and the socialist system. And suddenly you are in the sphere of Zionists controlling the world. That's, once you start getting there, once you start talking about this notion that Zionists control, the banks and the financial systems and politicians, and they're associated with the fifth column, you are in the anti-Semitic territory, because these are the main tropes of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And then you get to 1967, and that's when it really goes massive. It goes beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is then trying to reach with these ideas, the global left-wing masses. It's trying to reach the third world countries, as it was known, as they were known then, the post-colonial world. And that's when these tropes become part of the left-wing discourse. Already by 1970 or 71, there are observers in the West who are already talking then that anti-Zionism is new anti-Semitism. So when we talk about it today, that anti-Zionism is new anti-Semitism, we are 50 years late. We're, 60 years late. It was already anti-Semitic. It was understood as anti-Semitism already 60 years ago. But this is when, the Soviet Union's influence really was the strongest during the Cold War. And this is what we are still seeing today.
If you look at the scale of it, the investment, the consistency, it's severe. So what were the strategic goals, both internally and globally? This is, I think, very interesting for the audience to understand.
Well, this is actually a really important question, because the way the Soviets used their anti-Zionist philosophy and ideology, particularly after 67, in fact, has to do with what happened in 67. And what happened in 67 is the Six-Day War. And that's when, by then, the Arab states were Soviet allies and proteges, right? The Soviets were sponsoring them, financing them, training their armies. And the Soviets fully expected that the Six-Day War would result in Israel's loss. But when that didn't happen, and when Israel won in 6 days, without the support of the United States, by the way, the crisis it created in Moscow was so huge that they very quickly, they basically decided that they are up against this global force, the Zionist force, because otherwise, how could Israel win? How could the small country win against these massive Soviet-financed and trained Arab forces? The only answer really was that there is a powerful ideology that is plugged into power circles all over the world, and it's important for the Soviet Union to be fighting this ideology. It's interesting that I've been giving this lecture and talking about it in podcasts for years. And a lot of times I think people had trouble understanding. They would say, did they really think that? Did Moscow really think that Zionism was so powerful? People just couldn't believe that somebody could really seriously take this idea. I think today it's much easier for people because we see this idea everywhere, by the way, not only on the left. We look at people like Tucker Carlson, we look at Candace Owens, we look at what's in America called the woke right. They are talking about Zionists and Israel from that perspective. Like this whole idea that Israel convinced America, or not just convinced, that it was Israel that made President Trump go to war against Iran. How ridiculous is that, right? How, like, it's the superpower, right? America is the sole superpower today. Trump is the most powerful person in the world. You really think that a tiny country could force him to do anything? Have you not seen how Trump just makes his own decisions? And so it was the same way in those after 67 in Moscow, after the 6 Day War in Moscow. There was this view that, look, Zionists are everywhere. They control everything. They would look at America and they would say, look at how many Jews there are in influential places. Well, of course, they're Jews, and they are pro-Israel. Therefore, they run America. This is basically how it went. And so from there, it's like you create your own gremlins. You create your own kind of your own nightmares. It's like I often say that the KGB sort of having painted Zionism as this massive, globally powerful force that controls everything. They really believed in it. They really bought into it. And the more they believed it, the more they felt they needed to invest into fighting it. And so they brought in the Soviet academic resources into it. They brought their media power, and they had a lot of influence. They sponsored all these left-wing groups around the world. It's proven, it's not even sort of, we don't just think that, it's proven. They were sponsoring left-wing parties, national liberation movements. And part of the sponsorship was that if you publish something, you need to be publishing something that corresponds to what we think, something that you need to be aligning yourself ideologically with us. And that's when you start to see that alignment begin to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So to go back to your question, this was a very roundabout way to to answer your question. The summary of it is that there were geopolitical goals. There were some people in the USSR. I'm often asked, were they so invested in this fight because they were anti-Semitic personally, because there was a country of state-sponsored anti-Semitism? So was anti-Semitism the driving force, or was there something else? I think that they were both, but I think on the state level, the priority really was the geopolitical. They really believed that they were in the middle of the Cold War. They felt that Israel had shifted the balance of powers in the Middle East in a way that was unfavorable for the Soviets, and they understood the power of the ideology that they were putting out. Russia, we have to remember, Russia invented the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, okay? People always remember that Nazi Germany contributed massively to anti-Semitism in the world, right? We still have parties that imitate and groups that imitate Nazi ideology and agree with it and want to propagate it. Well, the Soviet Union invented the Protocols of the Elders of Russia invented the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, okay? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are really the essence of contemporary anti-Semitic ideology. The Nazis used the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in their propaganda. The Arab states received an infusion of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion through Christian missionaries, right? The Protocols were and remain a really influential, possibly the most influential a piece of anti-Semitic literature to this day, over a century later. So the Soviet Union, the Russians, and then the Soviet Union later, they knew exactly how to use anti-Semitic propaganda for their political purposes, because the protocols were very much used by the Tsarist regime for political purposes. And so the Soviet Union understands very quickly, when they start kind of spreading this anti-Zionist ideology around the world, they understand very quickly how useful it is. They know first of all, that it attracts people of all kinds of persuasions. You can be a communist, or you can be a bloody dictator or a genocidal dictator somewhere, and you will grab onto this ideology. And it will help you, and you will become part of the ecosystem. So they know exactly how to manipulate these anti-Jewish sentiments. They use the language of anti-Zionism because they can't sound like the Nazis. They know that. And so this is what happens, and in addition to the geopolitical reasons, there are also internal domestic issues that contribute to it, which we can get into. But essentially, yes, I think that on an individual level, there were people who were contributing to this campaign because they were personally anti-Semitic. There's no question about it. But on the state level, I think it was really the geopolitical interests that were driving them.
But it is remarkable because initially they rejected the Tsarist anti-Semitism, and then later adapted precisely literature like the protocols of the elders and so on, and just changed the terminology. It wasn't Jews anymore; it was the Zionists then.
I just want to say that, they officially never adopted the protocols, the Soviets. In the USSR, open anti-Semitic propaganda was prohibited. So the protocols were also prohibited, which didn't prevent them from circulating freely among party elites. And the people who essentially converted anti-Semitic conspiracy theory into the anti-Zionist conspiracy theory were people who were well familiar with the protocols. So officially, the Soviets spent a lot of time, just like we see people do today, defending themselves by saying that, well, we're just being anti-Zionist, we're not being anti-Semitic. We hear it all the time today. So even that has transferred into the current moment. But in reality, what we learn from this history, this is possibly the most important lesson of this history, is that you can claim that you're just being anti-Zionist and you're not being anti-Semitic. But if your anti-Zionism is based on the tropes of the protocols of the elders of Zion, you are propagating anti-Semitism and you are going to have anti-Semitic outcomes. And this is something that I had warned about, other people had warned about, and it's exactly what we're seeing today. People can't understand why is it that a leftist who wants to say, whose kind of battle cries free Palestine, why would he go and shoot Jews? Well, it's because the tropes are the same. Ultimately, you can't, if you consume this ideology, you ultimately come to the conclusion that Jews are your enemy, even if you don't say it in these words. This is ultimately what it's going to lead to.
So if you had to break it down, what were the core building blocks of that narrative? What were the key claims? Let's say, how did they package them in a way that felt morally persuasive rather than obviously ideological? Because that was very it was implemented skillfully.
Yes. Well, look, what they did is at the outset, they equated the Palestinian cause with all the other causes that the leftists were fighting for at the time. So the way they began introducing the Palestinian cause to the global left was by saying, the first people who were convinced, by the way, were the anti-apartheid activists. They would come to them and they would say, look, you're fighting against apartheid in South Africa, but look, this is exactly what's happening in Palestine. Palestinians are being treated in the same way as the Black population is being treated in South Africa. And then they would bring Palestinians to, let's say, a youth festival, which is what happened, for example, in 1973. There was a youth festival in East Berlin. And so there you see them equating, it was sponsored by the Soviets. So what they do there is they equate the Palestinian cause with the cause of the Chilean revolution. That's kind of the big cause then. And so they say, if you are in favor of Allende, and if you are in favor of the socialist revolution in Chile, then you should also be against Israel and you should be for Palestinians. The Palestinians are the good guys in the same way as the socialists in Chile are. And then they would say, well, if you're against the war in Vietnam, then you should also be, against the Israelis and for Palestinians, because the Israelis are doing to Palestinians exactly the same thing that the Americans are doing to the Vietnamese, which, of course, none of these equations are, and to the African Americans, they would say, and to the left in America, they would say, if you're fighting for the cause of civil rights in the United States, then you should also be fighting for the Palestinian rights, because what Israelis are being as racist toward Palestinians, just as whites are being racist toward the African Americans in the United States. So these are all false comparisons. They're false equations because all these situations are different. But this was one method. They would equate Zionism with all of humanity's ills, such as Nazism and fascism and apartheid, genocide, imperialism, colonialism, and they would equate Israelis or they would equate Palestinians with everything that's good in the world. So they set up this binary from the very beginning, and if you are a young leftist in those years, in the 60s and 70s, and you're part of these, you're fighting for all of these causes, and you see all of your friends being against imperialism and colonialism, and then suddenly an idea is introduced, well, then you also have to be against Zionism, and everybody around you is against Zionism already, then it just becomes part of the package. This is what I really believe happened, is that, if you were a young person in those times and in those years, in those last 25 years of the Cold War, and you fought against and were an activist, let's say, on campuses, and you were protesting against imperialism, colonialism, racism, and capitalism, you also were against Zionism. It just became that automatic. They made that connection, and it remained there. And I think a lot of people don't even think about it. It's just part of the package.
So would it be fair to say that Soviet anti-Zionism was one of the first large-scale campaigns that really managed to invert victim and aggressor? And how did these ideas actually travel to our time today? I mean, what you were describing from the 70s is precisely what we're experiencing today.
Well, I don't know probably enough to say if it was the first campaign of moral inversion, but certainly, and the inversion of victim and perpetrator, but it certainly was part of that. It is something that the Soviets worked very hard to do at the UN, for example. And the UN, of course, became a major seat through which the anti-Zionist ideology was propagated. But this is precisely what the Soviets were doing at the UN. And the contemporary observers discussed it, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who for a while was the American ambassador to the UN. He saw it loud and clear. He was there when the Zionism is Racism resolution was adopted, and he understood what a moral travesty it was. And he wrote for commentary, and then it ended up in books, that basically what the Soviets have done is that they have put everything on its head. So the states that had the worst violations of human rights adopted a strategy of accusing the West of human rights violations, even though, the Western states' democracies, of course, have never been perfect. They were never, you could accuse them also, of course, no question about that. But relatively speaking, it was the worst violators of human rights accusing the states that were the least violators and that also had laws and were, that had systems where you could, in place that could, that you could go to and say and seek redress for violations. So the moral inversion began, I think it was much bigger than, it was broader than just this anti-Zionist issue, but it was certainly a big part of it, no question about it.
Yeah, it was at the time, it was the Soviet bloc, and now we are observing the same with the Arab bloc within the UN. So, and this is where it gets particularly interesting. What role did alliance with Arab regimes and movements play in this process?
Well, I should say that the Soviets worked very closely with the Arab bloc at the time, already during the Cold War. So the Arab states obviously had their own massive anti-Zionist propaganda. And they and the Soviets worked very closely, and the Soviets worked very closely with the PLO and, the socialist bloc in general. The East Germany worked very closely with the PLO and channeled tons of money to them, armed them and trained them. And so, in many ways, this goes back to your question of what was driving them. So one of the geopolitical aspects here was that the Soviets wanted to please their Arab allies. And in fact, there are some very interesting findings by Russian historians who have covered this issue already in the post-Soviet period, who say that some of the people who became chief ideologues of this anti-Zionist ideology actually had very strong connections to Arab states. They were Arabists by training. They had spent a lot of time in the Arab states. And in some ways, they became kind of internal lobbyists for the Arab regimes within the Soviet elites. So they would, the Arabs would say, yeah, okay, well, you are being anti-Zionist, but it's not enough because Jews are still coming to Israel, and then they're joining the IDF, and then they're fighting against us in the IDF. So they would say you need to tighten the controls, and so there was that kind of dance between the Soviets and the Arab bloc was very, very, very powerful, very important, and influential.
And I think Western intellectuals were a part of it too, in laundering and legitimizing these narratives. Because speaking from an Iranian perspective, we have seen this before. In the late 70s, Western intellectuals like Sartre and Foucault openly supported Khomeini. Foucault even described his Islamism as a form of political spirituality, very similar to how the relativism in terms of anti-Zionism, which is in fact anti-Semitism, works. And the people who paid the price for this delusion were women and minorities and Jews, dissidents, and so on. Right. So it's remarkable. We see the same playbook today. Yeah. Which raises the question, did people in the West actually understand that they were adapting Soviet frameworks, or did these ideas arrive already sanitized, already stripped of their origin?
I think most people did not understand it. I think that the communist parties most certainly understood it, because when you look... I've spent some time reading the CPUSA journals, the Communist Party of the United States. We have an excellent example here of Angela Davis, who was a member of the Communist Party in America, very close to the Soviets, completely followed the party line, and she remains profoundly conspiratorially anti-Zionist in the same kind of Soviet way. They add their own stuff, they add new things, but fundamentally, the fundamentals are there. So I think people like them understood. I think that the editors of the journals, the CPUSA journals, certainly understood, because after 1967, it's not like they had been Zionist before. Communists were not, never. But again, after 1967, the tone changes radically. And they work closely with the Soviets to really help communicate the Soviet line on Zionism and Israel to the world. This is recorded in documents. We see that in archival documents. So I think some people certainly understood, but I would say that most people didn't. I think for most people, it arrived via these visceral experiences, visceral experiences like being with other young people. Like my favorite example, I have yet to write an article about it, but that festival that took place in East Berlin in 1973, you look at that, and it became known as the Red Woodstock, which the Woodstock was a massive, it's like, I guess, rock festival, music festival that people remember well. This is where you can see that I didn't grow up in America, but this was really how that festival. It's like in East Berlin, there was rock and roll, people danced in the streets, young people just engaged in really a lot of fun activities. They were all conducted under the slogan of anti-imperialism. We are against racism. All the young people of the world are against all these evils, and also against Zionism, and I think that when it's through these visceral experiences that people take on their beliefs. It most of the time, I think it doesn't, or let's say it's an important factor in shaping people's views. I think for most people, it was just what everybody believed. And so you believed it too. Look, I'll give you another example. When I came to America, I spent most of my time in the US on the East Coast. Typical liberal institutions, Harvard and, think tanks. And for most of my time in the US, I voted Democrat for maybe 20 years, and I never questioned that. And I never questioned that because everybody around me was voting Democrat. Like I never asked myself, why am I voting Democrat? What are the positions here that I subscribe to and aspire to, or rather affirm with my vote? It's just that everybody around me voted that way. And because I think I was new to America, I came to America when I was 20, I didn't really understand the system very well. But okay, in my view, then, everybody, it's like all the good people voted for Democrats. If you're in Massachusetts, then if you're in Boston, then all the good people vote for Democrats and all the bad people vote for Republicans. It's the same. It was the same in most of my circles. And so I think that this is probably what happened with this ideology as well. If everybody around you believes certain things, you just believe them too, because this is what good people believe in. And so you adopt it and you don't question it.
So it is basically an adaptation of a script, a Soviet script, basically.
To a considerable degree. I want to make it be careful and say that, there were a lot of other forces. Again, there were the Arab states, the American, Western intellectuals had their own theories and ideas, that were also, I think, very much influenced by the Soviets. But the influence was also a lot of times two-way. It was a two-way street. The Soviets would sometimes listen to Western intellectuals and to the Arab states and then amplify, incorporate their ideas and their propaganda and amplify it and put it out to the rest of the world. So I want to just, sometimes people think that what I'm saying is that it was just the Soviets alone who were pulling all the strings. No, we're talking about a lot of actors. But I think the ideas, the tropes, the way you explain the world, the way you explain the forces, the alignment of forces is very much Soviet.
Yeah. And this is maybe the core tension. These movements present themselves as progressive, emancipatory, anti-oppression.
Right.
And yet they're extremely rigid, binary, and quite totalitarian, which we can observe in Germany with the New Left is absolutely totalitarian movement, in my view. Do you see a structural similarity between Soviet ideology and parts of today's activist culture? Can you elaborate on that a little?
Tell me a little bit more about what you have in mind.
To me, it really feels, although they call themselves leftists, it's very communist,
right?
The way of thinking.
Right.
Would you agree?
Well, what I would say is that it's very anti-liberal. Liberal in the sense that, not in the American sense of, you're liberal or you're conservative. In the sense of, liberal democracy, there are liberal principles that underlie liberal democracies, right? There's rule of law. There is the principles of personal, the Bill of Rights in America. It's like the individual freedoms, right? The freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. They are not liberal ideologies in that sense. So they call themselves different things. In America, it's DSA, Democratic Socialists, they're Trotskyists, they're communists, they're socialists. The main thing to me is that they go beyond that line where, yes, you absolutely get into a totalitarian ideology. You're no longer in the realm of liberal democracy. You are moving into an authoritarian worldview. And, there are people who are doing research now, and there's more and more that we're starting to understand about people who espouse both anti-Semitic and if you separate these two, right? And classical anti-Semitic, like right-wing anti-Semitic point of view and left-wing anti-Zionist point of view. What unites them is that they all exhibit authoritarian perspectives, meaning that they're happy to walk all over your rights. They are happy to suppress your freedom of speech. They're happy to direct the media so that it only expresses the correct perspective. These are all elements of authoritarian views, and there are others as well. And for those of us who are, I'm sure that you feel it. I feel it as a ex-Soviet person, someone who grew up in the USSR. I feel it immediately. As soon
Yeah,
as
me too.
someone starts to try to shut my mouth or to tell me what to do, tell me what to think, I first
Yeah.
started to feel it, I think, around 2020,
Mm.
right as COVID began, and all of this authoritarian points of view poured into social media. I felt it right away. I
Yeah.
felt like it was just like a being thrown back to the USSR. So I'm extremely sensitive to it. I think a lot of us ex-Soviets are very sensitive to it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, absolutely. It's they remind us of our experiences with the Komsomol, the youth communist movement in the USSR, when all these young activists, Komsomol
Mm.
members, would come and tell you what to do and what to think. And they could call you in front of a meeting at work and, put you through a struggle session, to borrow, this is a term from the Chinese side of things, but the Soviets really invented all of it, shaming sessions, putting somebody down because they didn't display
Political
sufficient
correctness.
political correctness, exactly, insufficient enthusiasm for certain points of view, for certain ideologies. It's like we know
Yeah.
all of it, we recognize it. And so, yes, 100%, these people are authoritarian, whatever
Yeah.
label they assign themselves, and it's deeply problematic.
Yeah, I think the core similarity is collectivism. These people are collectivists. It
Yes,
doesn't matter on the right or on the left, that unites them.
yes,
So I think this very strict division between oppressor and oppressed, the moral absolutism, the intolerance for dissent,
right.
that is the similarity. Even on the right, they have this victim,
Yes,
attitude. We see
yes,
it in Tucker Carlson, these characters. So
totally.
if we zoom out for a moment, it starts to look less like a debate about Israel and more like a much broader anti-Western framework. Would you
Yes,
agree? So, and yet what's striking is as we said, the alignment with openly authoritarian or even theocratic regimes that clearly don't share any of the so-called progressive values they
right.
claim to represent. We have seen it before. In Iran, leftists and communists aligned with Islamists to overthrow the Shah, and shortly after Khomeini took power,
Right.
many of them were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. They disappeared in mass graves. Why does this pattern keep repeating?
That, of course, is the million-dollar question that we all want to have answered. Because if only people looked at the history of the 20th century, they would
Yeah.
understand that what they're doing is repeating those patterns. I mean, I think that the Iranian example is really just deeply tragic and so troubling, and it's so recent compared to others, because in the USSR, the repressions, you could say the repressions happened in the 20s, in the 30s. It's a long time ago. It's forgotten. There are very few people who are alive who lived through that time. If you grew up in the USSR, then you have relatives. My grandparents lived through that. It's like we know stories. But if you didn't grow up there, it's hard for you. It's like it's so long ago. In Iran, it happened so recently, relatively speaking. And yeah, the fact that people don't learn from that history is really incredible. I want to believe it. I mean, I think a big part here is that this history is simply not taught. You and I know this because we're from there. People who specifically study this history, they study it, but most people don't. When I give lectures about the USSR, people ask me questions that just make me stop and recognize that really how little people know about it, how poorly
Yeah.
they understand it. A lot of times people, young people especially, they don't even understand that in the USSR, one party controlled all the media. They don't understand what it's like. They don't
It's
understand
exactly
that
like in Iran. Mm.
Exactly. They don't understand that you couldn't leave the country, that it's just the knowledge is not there. And I think there are many solutions probably, or there are many ways to fix where we are now. I think we're all trying to find solutions to what we're dealing with. To my mind, one of the solutions that needs to be there in the mix is that we need to start teaching that the history of left authoritarianism,
Yeah.
because young people today, I think, grow up, and this, by the way, is true, is also among the Jewish community. I have found it so frustrating that American Jews could tell you everything about Nazi Germany and how Nazi Germany did horrible things to Jews, but they never learned that the left can also be terrible for Jews as well. It's like it doesn't look the same, but it doesn't mean that it's harmless. In the end, millions of Soviet Jews left the Soviet Union. There was a reason. The anti-Zionist anti-Semitism of the Soviet Union produced precisely the kind of outcomes we're seeing today. Pogromist sentiments, even though you're only talking about Zionists, exclusion from universities, from entire career paths, from professions, suspicion of Jews. No matter, it doesn't matter what your views are. You're going to be suspicious because you are a Jew. And right now there's an anti-Zionist campaign going on. So nobody wanted to hear it. Nobody could imagine it. So I think we need to start teaching that history.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would create some resilience towards certain ideas. If they would understand history, they would understand who has the incentives to push these ideas also. Do you see active continuation by states like Russia or Iran? You see where I'm going? Or has this become something more diffuse or almost self-sustaining?
Well, self-sustaining, I think, is a very good term. So I think that Russia definitely plays in the current environment because, Russia today is not ideologically anti-Zionist the way the Soviet Union was. It's not kind of an ideology that's central to Russia's understanding of itself. But it knows how to play the game, and it knows what fires it can light up by throwing those ideas out into the world. And the ideas are already there. They've created those ideas. They've put them out. I literally see Soviet pamphlets floating on the internet or being kind of recreated by others today. I see the sources where they take the information from. But the Russians don't have the same resources today to do it. They don't have the same ideological motivations, but they have other motivations. There are ideological motivations. They're just different. They want to be contributing to the chaos. They want to be contributing to the disruptions within our societies. Look at what people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens are doing, how they are just creating. It's more than divisions, right? They've created a crisis in the Republican Party, but they're also inflaming sentiments, anti-Jewish sentiments in the society. And the Russians know, Putin comes from that system. Lavrov, the foreign minister, comes from that system, right? They came of age professionally in that system. They know exactly what gets inflamed when anti-Semitic sentiments permeate public conversation, which is, by the way, I think is the same reason that China is doing it. Because China, I'm not a China expert, but my understanding is that, China never really had its own native anti-Semitic tradition like the way Russia did. But it's contributing to anti-Semitic propaganda and anti-Semitism slushing through social media because it knows how disruptive it is. So yes, I think the Russians are very much there. They want for the enmity to continue. They want for the conflict to continue. They want for everybody to be pointing their fingers at the Jews and at Israel. But I don't think that they are kind of the main player today. I think that, the money now comes from Qatar, but the ideas are all there.
Yeah, well, Qatar represents Iran, and it's and ultimately it's all all these regimes are anti-Western
Right.
regimes.
Right.
So I think it's anti-Semitism, or as they call it, anti-Zionism, is just the most effective tool they have in belt. So
100%. Well, and let me just say something about it, because look, the fact that we now are starting to understand that anti-Zionism and all this Israelophobia, that ultimately what it stands for is anti-Western ideologies,
yeah,
is precisely how it was invented. It was precisely invented to serve precisely this purpose. I want to go back again and repeat for your listeners that this all comes back to the Cold War. The Cold War was about the socialist bloc, the USSR, against the West. And so anti-Zionism became a tool in that war. They understood that they could never defeat America militarily, so they were playing for influence throughout the post-colonial world, throughout Africa, throughout Asia, the Middle East, certainly Latin America. And anti-Zionism was one of the tools in that war. But yes, fundamentally, it was about them versus the West. And this is exactly what we're seeing today.
how much of this acceleration is driven by social media? You mentioned Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. The reach they have today, these propagandists, is beyond anything we know historically has existed. It's really alarming, and I thought about it a lot, how to mitigate that, because we have this discussion right now here in Germany about regulations, web regulations, internet regulations, and I don't think that's the way to go. That's also we don't want to give the state so much power,
Right.
but we need a new approach to this, because it's exponential right now. We can see the eruption of anti-Semitism.
Right.
Since, I wouldn't even say since 2023. It's probably 2015. Would you agree? It has become severe.
Well, it's interesting that you go back to then, because I think I first noticed it, and I know I've spoken to other people who've also noticed it. Right around then, I would say more specifically 2014. 2014 was when Hamas kidnapped three teenagers, Israeli teenagers, and then they were found dead. And that's when Israel entered Gaza, and it was one of those wars. And I remember noticing how twisted the media coverage was, and then also seeing it on social media. The distortion is when I first noticed the distortion then. A lot of people date the resurgence of contemporary anti-Zionism to 2001. So the Soviet Union died in 91. And it's interesting that that's a time when a lot of prominent leftists, you can see that like 89, 1990, 91 is when their careers changed direction. And I can't prove it, but I actually think that it's not unrelated, because suddenly the money from the USSR stopped flowing. So all of these publications suddenly stop printing. They all end their lives. All these communist publications stop in the West, stop at around 1990, 91. So then we have a decade when we don't yet know what happened. I think that the anti-Israel forces were regrouping. And then 2001 is when we have the Durban conference, the UN conference in Durban. And a lot of scholars kind of date the current explosion to that. But, I personally, yes, because that's when the boycott movement begins, the academic boycott and BDS. But I personally only began to see it 2014. And then from then on, yes, social media has become really terrible. It's become really, really bad in the last couple of years, I think, in my view. And, what's really we were talking about moral inversions, and what you also have is twisted incentives. Because I've seen it already with a number of figures, that as soon as they shift into the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic rhetoric, their following just goes through the roof. They attract an
Exactly.
incredible number of followers, which gives them an incentive. It gives them a material and a moral incentive. They actually think that just because they are now, they have millions of followers, it means that they're actually speaking the truth. Whereas we know that, okay, conspiracy theory attracts a lot of people. It attracts a lot of followers. And
But it's
so
also a lot of bot
a lot of
followers.
bots. That's
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. So they attract the attention of those who want to pump this rhetoric up into the
Yeah.
algorithm, who want to manipulate the algorithm. And so, so the question for me here is that, I would like to know how many millions of people who supposedly follow Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson are real people as opposed to bots. So
Yeah.
people like Megyn Kelly today,
Yeah.
and I'm interested in it because I've actually started to realize more and more that, there is actually a big world out there of people who aren't really on social media, who don't really know these names. And it's, if there's any ray of hope for me now, it's that I think a lot of people are turned off by the rhetoric online, and they
Absolutely.
are, right, they're not participating in it. And, some of it is you can see, it's why that there are these discrepancies where online you see one point of view, but then the surveys will show something different. So I think
Yeah.
we need to somehow figure out really, I'm not one of those people who say that, what happens online stays online and doesn't have any influence on real life. I think there's a two-way street. There's influence both ways. But I also think that I want to see, I would love to see some research that shows really how
Yeah.
many of those people are real people.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. It's a very good point. So this leads to a harder question. Can something like this even be undone once it's embedded at this level? You see what I mean? So
Yeah.
what would it realistically take to disrupt it now?
I mean, look, this is the big question. I don't think any of us have an answer to it. I think we're all looking at things from our own perspectives and offering our own solutions. In the end, I think there will not be a single solution. I think that it will take a number of solutions of people working through different areas, through their own fields of expertise. But I can tell you one thing that I, for example, really like that also gives me hope. I go back to education because that's what I understand. So there is research that shows that if you prepare young people by kind of exposing them to propaganda and pre-bunking it, there's this term of pre-bunk certain ideas that they will encounter on social media, that can at least prepare them not fall for it. It's like inoculating someone against a disease. So some
Exactly.
people
Yeah.
have done this research, they've done some videos where it's like you show young people these ideas and you explain what's wrong with these ideas. If you do it preventively, you will have a better chance at making sure that they don't adopt these propagandistic ideas than if they first swam in the sea of anti-Semitic propaganda online and then you try to debunk it. So right now, what we're doing is that we're allowing our young people to enter the sea of anti-Semitic propaganda completely unprepared. And we're saying, well, let them figure it out on their own. We're a free society. Let them. But if you haven't given them the tools to figure it out, then they won't know. How would they figure it out?
Exactly.
What tools do they have? Right? They have none. They don't know history. They have no tools. And so in that sense, I think there's a real malpractice going on here. Educational malpractice. And I don't know at what age you need to start. I remember a few years ago, people were talking about teaching critical thinking, teaching people to understand, to how to tell. Okay, maybe I don't really know what it means. How do you teach critical thinking? I think that all of your education should be directed at teaching people critical thinking. But I think we need to be teaching young people specifically, how do you tell what's propaganda, what's not? How do you deal with these destructive ideas that are extremely seductive? And we need to do it at an early age.
Izabella, thank you. This was incredibly clarifying. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. And I think ex-Soviet citizens of the former Soviet Union and Iranian refugees, I think we understand certain things that others don't. And I'm really delighted to be here with you. I think we can teach a lot of people from our experience.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.